In April 1944, a skinny 19-year-old kid walked up to his commanding officer holding a submachine gun. But not a real submachine gun. This thing was built from scrap parts, spent shell casings, rusted tractor components, and I kid you not, a spring from his father's John Deere back in Nebraska. The officer took one look at it, laughed in the kid's face. "Son," he said, "if you want to commit suicide, there are faster ways." The whole barracks erupted, guys pointing, snickering. Someone called it a pipe dream wrapped in duct tape. Someone else said it looked like a vacuum cleaner and a rifle had an ugly baby. 12 months later, that same suicide machine had a confirmed kill count of 127 Germans. And the kid who built it? He was standing in front of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, receiving the Distinguished Service Cross. But here's the thing, the medal ceremony isn't the story. The 127 kills isn't the story. The real story is 45 seconds. One moment in the middle of a French village. One desperate charge against impossible odds. 21 Germans. One homemade weapon. And a farm boy who proved every single person who ever laughed at him dead wrong. This is the untold story of Private Harold Raymond Beckman, the most underestimated soldier of World War II. And I'm about to show you exactly how he did it. Harold Beckman was born on March 3rd, 1925, in a town so small it doesn't exist anymore. Hartwell, Nebraska. Population, 347. Main industry, corn. Secondary industry, watching corn grow. His father, Raymond Sr., ran a struggling farm about 12 miles outside of town. His mother, Martha, had died giving birth to Harold's younger sister, who also didn't survive. So from the age of 6, it was just Harold and his father. 2 people, 1 farm, and an endless series of broken machines. Here's what you need to understand about growing up on a farm in rural Nebraska during the Great Depression. Nothing worked. Ever. Tractors broke down. Plows bent. Pumps failed. And you couldn't afford to replace anything. So you learned to fix things. Or you starved. Harold's father taught him the basics: how to weld, how to jury rig, how to make something work even when it had no business working. But by the time Harold was 10, the student had surpassed the teacher. The kid could look at a broken machine and just see how it was supposed to work. Like he had X-ray vision for mechanisms. There's a letter from his childhood friend, a man named Earl Patterson, who later became the town's only mechanic. Harry could fix anything. Patterson wrote decades later. I once saw him rebuild a Model T engine using parts from 3 different tractors and a sewing machine. Thing ran for 6 more years. I still don't understand how. By 12, Harold was the unofficial repairman for half the farms in the county. By 15, he'd built his first engine from scratch using an old oil drum, some copper piping, and what he called creative borrowing from the town junkyard. But here's where the story takes a turn. Harold wasn't just interested in building things that worked. He was obsessed with building things that worked fast. Speed, efficiency, maximum output for minimum input. He'd spend hours at the town library, the only building with electricity for 20 miles, reading about mechanical engineering. Pneumatics, hydraulics, anything he could get his hands on. And in 1939, when Harold was 14 years old, he stumbled across an article in Popular Mechanics magazine that would change his life forever. The article was about the Thompson submachine gun, the Tommy gun, the Chicago typewriter. The gun that had defined an era of American crime was now being shipped overseas to help the British fight Hitler. The article included a simplified diagram of the gun's internal mechanism, the Blish lock, the compensator, and the drum magazine system. Harold was transfixed, not because he wanted to be a gangster, not because he was fascinated by violence, but because the Thompson was, in his words, the most beautiful machine I'd ever seen. From his journal, dated September 14, 1939, the Thompson fires 600 rounds per minute. That's 10 bullets every second. And it does it reliably, with minimal jamming, in conditions that would destroy most weapons. How? The Blish principle, the compensator design, the feed mechanism. It's not just a gun. It's a symphony of engineering. I want to understand how it works. I want to build one myself. Remember, this is a 14-year-old farm boy in rural Nebraska. He's never seen a Thompson in person. He's never fired any kind of automatic weapon. He's working from a single magazine article and pure imagination. Over the next 2 years, Harold Beckman would attempt to build a working submachine gun 37 times. Every single attempt failed. Now let's talk about those failures, because they matter. The first prototype, built in 1940, when Harold was 15, was essentially a metal tube with a spring mechanism. He'd modeled it on the Thompson's basic principle, a bolt that reciprocates a fixed firing pin and a magazine feed. Problem: Harold had never seen an actual bolt mechanism. He'd only seen diagrams, and diagrams don't tell you about tolerances. The gap between the bolt and the chamber was off by about 2 millimeters. When Harold tested it using a .45 caliber round he'd borrowed from his father's pistol ammunition, the casing ruptured. The resulting explosion nearly took off 2 of his fingers. His father found him in the barn, bleeding, holding a twisted piece of metal that used to be a gun. According to Earl Patterson, Raymond Sr. said exactly 5 words. "Did you learn something?" Harold nodded. "Then wash up. Dinner's getting cold." That was the Beckman parenting philosophy in a nutshell. Feed fast. Learn faster. Keep your fingers if you can, but the knowledge is what matters. Prototypes number 2 through 7 all had the same basic problem. Harold couldn't get the cycling mechanism right. A submachine gun needs to fire continuously one round after another as long as you hold the trigger. This requires incredibly precise timing. The bolt has to move back, eject the casing, pick up a new round, chamber it, and fire again, all in about 1/10 of a second. Too slow, and the gun jams. Too fast, and it explodes. Harold was working with hand tools, scrap metal, and zero formal training. He didn't have machining equipment. He didn't have precision instruments. He was eyeballing tolerances that professional gunsmiths measure in thousandths of an inch. Why prototype 12? Harold had a new problem. The barrel kept overheating. The Thompson solves this with a cooling mechanism and high-quality steel. Harold was using whatever metal he could find: old tractor parts, rusted pipes, pieces of agricultural equipment. He tested prototype 12 with a sustained burst of about 15 rounds. The barrel glowed red. Then it warped. Then the next round fired sideways, punching through the barn wall and narrowly missing their milk cow. His father was less understanding this time. The cow was worth money. Harold was banned from testing anything on the farm. From then on, he did his testing in an abandoned quarry about 3 miles away, using a system of ropes and weights so he could fire his prototypes from a safe distance. Smart? Yes. But it also meant he couldn't feel what was happening with the gun, couldn't make real-time adjustments. I was always learning from explosions rather than preventing them. Prototypes 13 through 20 all failed in various spectacular ways. 1 melted, 3 exploded, 2 actually fired correctly for about 10 rounds before the magazines failed. The magazine was the real challenge. The Thompson uses a drum magazine that holds 50 rounds. It's a marvel of engineering, a spiral feed mechanism that pushes rounds toward the chamber with consistent pressure. Harold tried to replicate it with homemade springs and salvaged metal. Every version either jammed immediately or fed rounds so fast they'd stack on top of each other. By 1941, Harold was 16 years old. He'd been working on this project for 2 years, spent every spare dollar on materials, sacrificed countless hours that could have gone toward the farm, and he had nothing to show for it but 30 failed prototypes and a collection of spectacular scars. Then, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. America was going to war, and Harold Raymond Beckman knew exactly where he wanted to be. Harold tried to enlist the day after Pearl Harbor. He was 16 years old. The recruiter took one look at him, 5'7", 140 pounds, with more scars on his hands than most combat veterans, and told him to come back when he could grow a beard. Harold went home, kept working on his prototypes, waited. On his 18th birthday, March 3rd, 1943, he was at the recruitment office before it opened. This time they took him, but barely. Harold passed the physical, just. His eyesight was decent. His hearing was fine, but he was underweight, under-muscled, and according to the intake sergeant, looked like a stiff breeze would knock him into next week. He was assigned to the 90th Infantry Division, sent to Camp Barkley in Texas for basic training. Basic training was not kind to Harold Beckman. He couldn't keep up with the runs, struggled with the obstacle course, was consistently the last man to complete any physical challenge. His drill sergeant, a terrifying giant named Sergeant Marcus Cole, made Harold his personal project, which is to say, he made Harold's life a living hell. Beckman, my grandmother moves faster than you, and she's been dead for 6 years. Beckman, if you fall behind one more time, I will personally mail you back to whatever corn-fed backwater produced you. Beckman, were you raised by particularly slow turtles? The other recruits laughed. Harold took the abuse quietly, kept his head down, focused on the only thing he was good at. Because here's the thing about basic training in 1943, it included a lot of weapons training. And weapons training meant Harold finally got his hands on actual military hardware. For the first time in his life, Harold Beckman could examine real, functioning automatic weapons up close. Not diagrams, not magazine articles. The real thing. Moeigorons, Browning automatic rifles. And yes, Thompson submachine guns. Harold's performance on a rifle range was unexpected. The same kid who couldn't complete a 3-mile run in under 30 minutes? He scored an expert on every weapon he touched. His groupings were tighter than recruits with 10 times his training. Sergeant Cole noticed. Beckman, how the hell are you doing that? Harold's answer became famous in the 90th Division. Sir, I understand how the machine works, sir. Once you understand the machine, you just have to not get in its way, sir. Cole stared at him for a long moment. That's either the smartest or the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But Harold's real talent wasn't shooting. It was understanding. He could field strip any weapon faster than anyone in his unit, could diagnose and fix jams that left other soldiers baffled. When a Browning automatic rifle in Charlie Company developed a mysterious feeding problem, Harold was brought in to look at it. He fixed it in 11 minutes. It had been malfunctioning for 3 weeks. Word spread. Harold Beckman became the go-to guy for anything mechanical. Other soldiers started calling him Pipes, partly because of his obsession with gun barrels, partly because he was as thin as one. And somewhere in all of this, Harold made a decision that would change everything. He was going to finish what he started. He was going to build his own submachine gun. Not back home in Nebraska here, in the Army, with access to real parts, real machining equipment, and real expertise. The Army, of course, had absolutely no idea what he was planning. What Harold did over the next 10 months was technically illegal. Definitely against military regulations. Possibly court-martial worthy. He was acquiring parts, stealing time on the machining equipment, bribing quartermasters with cigarettes he didn't smoke, building a weapon that no one had authorized. And he was doing it in plain sight. The beauty of Harold's plan was its simplicity. He was the fix-it guy. Everyone brought him broken weapons. And broken weapons needed parts. Parts that, sometimes, weren't quite as broken as Harold reported. A firing pin from a Jam Thompson? Unrepairable, sir. Needs to be scrapped. A bolt assembly from a damage bar? Cracked, sir. Can't be salvaged. The tractor spring he'd brought from home, his good luck charm, he told people, was actually the core of his recoil system. By January 1944, Harold had accumulated enough components to attempt prototype. 38, but this one was different. This one incorporated everything he'd learned. From his failures in Nebraska, from his training, from examining dozens of actual military weapons. The design was a hybrid. It used a Thompson-style bolt mechanism, but with a simplified Blish lock that was easier to manufacture. A bar-inspired barrel cooling system. A completely original magazine design that held 35 rounds in a curved box configuration. A modified firing mechanism that allowed both semi-automatic and fully automatic fire. And that tractor spring, re-engineered to provide consistent recoil absorption. The whole thing looked like a fever dream. Seriously, if you've seen pictures of it, and they do exist in military archives, it looks like someone dropped a Thompson, a bar, and a sewing machine into a blender and hit puree. Parts were mismatched. Some were painted, some rusted. The stock was hand-carved wood from a crate that used to hold mortar rounds. The grip was wrapped in leather from an old boot, but here's what mattered. The tolerances were perfect. Harold had finally figured out the secret. It wasn't about having nice parts. It was about having parts that fit together precisely. Every component in his creation had been hand-measured, filed, adjusted, and remeasured until it was exactly right. He tested it in February 1944. Found an abandoned barn about 10 miles from camp. Set up a target range. Said his prayers. Prototype 38 fired 200 rounds without a single jam. The cycling was smooth. The accuracy was better than a standard Thompson. The recoil was manageable despite the light weight. It was ugly as sin and beautiful as a sunrise. Harold cried. Actually cried. The first time he'd done that since his mother's funeral. Of course, now he had a problem. What the hell was he supposed to do with an illegal homemade weapon? He couldn't use it. Carrying a non-standard weapon into combat would get him arrested. Maybe shot, depending on who caught him. But he couldn't leave it behind either. This was his life's work. The answer to a question he'd been asking for 5 years. So Harold did what any reasonable person would do. He hid it in his duffel bag, wrapped it in clothes, shipped it with his personal effects when the 90th Division transferred to England in March 1944. Yes, Harold Beckman smuggled a homemade submachine gun across the Atlantic Ocean through military checkpoints into an active war zone. And somehow, nobody noticed. The 90th Infantry Division arrived in England in March 1944. Everyone knew what was coming. The invasion of France. The liberation of Europe. The beginning of the end of Hitler's Reich. What nobody knew was the exact date. Or exactly where they'd land. Or exactly how many of them wouldn't be coming home. The mood in those English camps was strange. Excitement mixed with terror. Boredom punctuated by training exercises designed to simulate hell. And it was in this atmosphere that Harold Beckman's secret finally came out. The story, according to 3 different eyewitness accounts, happened on the evening of April 12, 1944. Harold was in his barracks, cleaning his weapon. Not his issued M1 Garand weapon. Prototype 38. The creation. Private First Class Tommy Reynolds walked past, glanced down, and stopped dead. What the hell is that? Harold tried to cover it. Too late. Beckman, is that a gun? It looks like a gun, and a vacuum cleaner had a baby. Within 5 minutes, half the platoon was gathered around Harold's bunk, staring at his creation. The reactions ranged from confused to mocking to genuinely concerned. Is that a tractor spring? Did you put a tractor spring in a gun? Pipes, buddy, have you lost your mind? If you fire that thing, it's going to kill you, not the Germans. Sergeant Cole pushed through the crowd, looked at the weapon, looked at Harold, picked it up. He examined it for almost 2 full minutes. Worked the action, checked the magazine, squinted down the barrel. Then he handed it back. Beckman, did you build this? Yes, sir. You understand this is completely against regulations. Yes, sir. You understand I could have you court-martialed. Yes, sir. Long pause. The whole barracks held its breath. How many rounds does it hold? 35, sir. Curved box magazine. Rate of fire? Around 550 rounds per minute on full auto, sir. I tuned it down for reliability. Another long pause. Does it actually work? Yes, sir. 200 rounds without a jam. Cole nodded slowly. Then he walked away. He didn't report Harold. Didn't confiscate the weapon. Just walked away. But the damage was done. The story spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, everyone in the 90th Division knew about Pipes Beckman and his homemade Tommy gun. The mockery was relentless. Hey, Pipes, what's next? A tank made from tin cans. Beckman, when the invasion starts, can you cover me with your sewing machine? I heard. Beckman's building a rocket ship from toilet parts. Gonna take on the Luftwaffe single-handed. Harold took it all quietly. Never argued. Never defended himself. Just kept maintaining his creation, running drills with his issued M1, waiting for the invasion that everyone knew was coming. What nobody knew that nobody could possibly guess was that in less than 3 months, every single person who had mocked Harold Beckman would be eating their words. Or dead. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The 90th Infantry Division didn't land on the beaches. They came in 3 days later, on June 9th, at Utah Beach. By then, the immediate chaos had passed. The beach was secured. The hedgerows were not. If you know anything about the Normandy campaign, you know about the hedgerows. Bocage country, dense vegetation, ancient dirt walls, and sunken roads that created natural killing zones. The Germans had fortified this terrain brilliantly. Every field was a potential ambush. Every corner could hide a machine gun nest. Every hedgerow could conceal death. The American forces had expected to break through this country in days. It took months for Harold Beckman. The first 3 weeks of combat were a crash course in hell. He watched friends die, saw men torn apart by artillery, experienced the particular horror of close-quarters combat, where the enemy is close enough that you can see their faces. His issued M1 Garand served him well. Good rifle, reliable. But in the hedgerow fighting, Harold kept thinking about his creation, still wrapped in his duffel, still hidden, still unused. The M1 Garand fires 8 rounds per clip. Then you have to reload. In the hedgerows, 8 rounds weren't always enough. Sometimes the Germans came in waves. Sometimes you needed sustained fire just to keep their heads down. Sometimes reloading meant dying. Harold started to think, maybe there's a place for my weapon after all. July 3rd, 1944. The 90th Division was ordered to take a small village called Saint-Germain-sur-Elle. Intelligence said it was lightly defended. A few German stragglers. Maybe a mortar position. Nothing Harold's platoon couldn't handle. Intelligence was wrong. The village was garrisoned by elements of the 352nd Infantry Division veterans of the Eastern Front, battle-hardened, determined to hold every inch of French soil. Harold's platoon walked into an ambush about a half-mile from the village center. The first burst of machine gun fire killed 3 men instantly. Tommy Reynolds, the first person to mock Harold's weapon, was among them. Sergeant Cole screamed for everyone to take cover. Harold dubbed behind a stone wall. Bullets snapped overhead. Someone was screaming. Someone else was praying. The platoon was pinned down. 2 MG, 42 positions had them in a crossfire. Every time someone tried to move, the machine guns would open up. They were stuck there for 6 hours, 0.6 hours of baking sun. No water, wounded men crying for help that couldn't come. 6 hours of watching the ammunition count tick down and knowing that when night fell, the Germans would probably advance. Around 1800 hours, Cole crawled over to Harold's position. Beckman, how many rounds do you have left? 12, sir. Plus 2 clips in my bag. That's it. Yes, sir. Cole was silent for a moment. Then your thing. The one you built. Is it still in your gear? Harold blinked. He hadn't expected that. Yes, sir. Back at the CP. Could you get to it? Maybe. If I go through that drainage ditch. Could you use it to do something about those guns? Harold considered the question. Consider the machine gun nests. Consider the angles, the distances, and the timing. Maybe. If I can get close enough. How close? 50 feet. Maybe less. Cole awed. It wasn't a happy laugh. 50 feet. From an MG 42 nest. With a homemade gun. Yes, sir. Long pause. Beckman, I've never said this to anyone, and I will never say it again. If you want to try, I won't stop you. But you should know that what you're proposing is suicide. Harold nodded. I know, sir. But staying here is also suicide. Just slower. Harold began his crawl at 1845 hours. The sun was starting to set, but there was still plenty of light. Plenty of opportunities to be seen. Plenty of ways to die. The drainage ditch was barely 2 feet deep. Harold had to move on his belly, pushing with his elbows and toes, keeping his head below the level of the surrounding grass. The command post was about 800 yards behind their position. In normal conditions, that would be a 15-minute walk. Crawling, staying invisible, moving slowly enough that the grass didn't rustle noticeably. Harold estimated 2 hours, maybe more. Every few minutes, the machine guns would open up. Random bursts. Suppression fire. Reminding everyone that death was always watching. Harold would freeze. Wait. Resume crawling. His elbows started bleeding about 20 minutes in. The ground was rocky, uneven. Every inch forward was paid for in scrapes and bruises. At one point, a German patrol passed within 30 feet of his position. 4 men, talking casually. One was eating an apple. Harold didn't breathe, didn't blink. Watched them walk past. They didn't see him. Maybe the fading light helped. Maybe they weren't looking for a single American soldier crawling through a ditch like a snake. It took Harold 2 hours and 43 minutes to reach the command post. When he got there, it was chaos. Medics working on wounded men. Officers screaming into radios. The whole operation is falling apart. Nobody noticed Harold grab his duffel. Nobody asked questions when he pulled out Prototype 38, his tractor spring creation. Nobody stopped him when he loaded 2 spare magazines and started crawling back toward the front. The return trip was faster. Harold knew the route now, knew where the safe spots were, knew the patrol patterns. By 2200 hours, he was back at the stone wall, back with what remained of his platoon. Sergeant Cole looked at him, looked at the weapon. You actually did it. Yes, sir. That thing ready to work. Harold worked the action, checked the magazine, verified the firing mechanism. Ready, sir. Okay, then. Cole took a deep breath. What's your plan? Harold had been thinking about this during the entire crawl. There's a blind spot between the 2 nests. Neither gun can cover it completely. If I move fast enough, I can get within 50 feet of the first nest before they know I'm there. And then, 35 rounds at 550 per minute. 3-second burst. That's about 30 rounds on target. Then transition to the second nest before they can react. And if you miss, then you'll know because I'll be dead and they'll be shooting at you again. Cole stared at him for a long moment. Pipes. Harold, are you sure about this? Harold nodded. I've been building toward this moment for 5 years, sir. I'm sure. At 2,217 hours on July 3rd, 1944, Private Harold Raymond Beckman began his approach to the German machine gun nests. The night was dark, a new moon. Visibility was maybe 30 feet, if you knew what you were looking for. Harold knew. The first nest was positioned behind a destroyed farmhouse. 2 gunners, maybe a third man on ammunition duty. MG-42, belt-fed, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. The Germans called it Hitler's buzzsaw. American soldiers called it the sound of death. Harold moved through the darkness, step by step. Eaten be eaten. His creation held low, pressed against his chest. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. The Germans were talking. He could hear them, complaining about the food, joking about a girl back home. Normal soldier talk. 20 feet. Harold could see them now. 3 figures around the gun. One was lighting a cigarette. The match flared, illuminating his face for just a second. Young. Maybe Harold's age. Maybe younger. Harold raised his weapon. And in that moment, something happened that Harold would write about years later, in a letter he never sent. I thought I would hesitate. I thought I would think about it. I thought I would see their faces and remember that they were human beings with mothers and fathers and people who loved them. But I didn't. I thought about Tommy Reynolds, dead in a ditch with half his head missing. I thought about the screaming wounded men who couldn't get to a medic. I thought about 5 years of building, of failing, of teaching myself to understand machines so completely that they became extensions of my own body. And then I pulled the trigger. The first burst was perfect. Harold's creation roared to life. The muzzle flash illuminated the scene in strobing light. The 3 Germans never knew what hit them. 15 rounds in about 2 seconds. All on target. All. Lethal. Before the last body hit the ground, Harold was already moving. The second nest was 40 feet away. They'd heard the shooting. They were scrambling to rotate their gun. Harold didn't give them time. 20 feet of distance covered in 3 strides. 3 more Germans. One was reaching for a sidearm. Another burst. 10 rounds. 2.5 seconds. 3 more bodies. But now the alarm was raised. Shouts in German. Movement in the darkness. More soldiers emerging from buildings, from trenches, from hidden positions. This is where Harold's story diverges from the legend. The 21 Germans in 45 seconds figure comes from the official after-action report. But the reality was messy, chaotic, less like a movie and more like a nightmare. Harold kept firing, kept moving, used a cover when he could find it, changed magazines once, his hands moving by instinct rather than conscious thought. At one point, a German soldier tackled him from the side. They rolled in the dirt. The German was bigger, stronger, fighting for his life. Harold's weapon was knocked away. What saved him was the knife in his boot. 3 inches of steel that his father had given him before he shipped out. In case you need to cut yourself free from something, Raymond Sr. had said. Harold cut himself free. He recovered his weapon, kept moving, kept killing. By the time it was over, by the time Harold's magazine ran dry and the surviving Germans were fleeing into the night, 45 seconds had passed. 21 confirmed dead, 3 wounded, an entire defensive position destroyed. Harold stood in the darkness, surrounded by bodies, his homemade weapon smoking in his hands. And then, very quietly, he threw up. The platoon advanced through the night, took the village by dawn, found the Germans had retreated so quickly they'd left hot coffee on the tables. Harold didn't remember most of it. He was operating on autopilot. Shock, probably. The adrenaline crash that comes after the kind of violence that rewires your brain forever. When they finally stopped to rest, Sergeant Cole found Harold sitting alone, staring at nothing. Beckman. No response. Harold looked up. His eyes were empty. You did well tonight. Long pause. I killed 21 men. Yeah, you did. And because you did, the rest of us are still alive. That matters. You understand? That matters. Harold nodded. He wasn't sure if he understood. Wasn't sure if he ever would. But he was alive. And so were 14 other soldiers who would have died in that ambush. The news spread fast. By the end of the week, Harold Beckman was famous throughout the 90th Division. The story got exaggerated, of course. By the time it reached division headquarters, Harold had single-handedly destroyed 3 machine gun nests, captured a German officer, and disabled a tank with his bare hands. The reality was impressive enough. The division commander, Major General J. McKelvey, personally requested to see the weapon that had accomplished all this. Harold demonstrated prototype 38 at a firing range. Perfect function, 0 jams, accuracy comparable to standard-issue weapons. McKelvey was silent for a long moment. Private Beckman, where exactly did you learn to do this? My father's farm, sir. Nebraska, sir. You built this from scrap parts? Yes, sir. And a tractor spring, sir. McKelvey laughed, then got serious. I'm going to pretend this weapon doesn't exist. Officially, but unofficially. Beckman, I want you to keep using it. And I want you to teach others what you know about weapons maintenance and modification. Yes, sir. One more thing. McKelvey leaned in. Never tell the ordnance department. Anymore. I used to build things to understand how they worked. Now I only build things to destroy. What happens when the war ends? What do I do with these hands? April 8th, 1945. Less than a month before Germany's surrender. Harold's unit was advancing through a small town in Bavaria. Resistance was light. The German army was collapsing. Everyone knew the end was coming. Harold was clearing a building standard procedure, room by room, when he encountered a German soldier hiding in a basement. The soldier was young, maybe 16, maybe younger. He was holding a Luger pistol, but it was shaking so badly he couldn't aim. Harold had his weapon raised. 3 pounds of pressure, and the kid would be dead. Another number for the tally. But something happened. The German kid dropped his pistol, started crying, said something Harold couldn't understand, showed him a photograph he was carrying. His family, his mother, his father, 2 younger sisters. Normal people. People who would get the telegram and mourn and never understand why their son had to die in a basement in Bavaria. Harold lowered his weapon. For the first time since July 3rd, 1944, Harold Beckman had a clear shot at an enemy soldier and chose not to take it. He tied the kid up, left him for the MPs, walked away. That night, Harold wrote his last journal entry of the war. I thought killing was becoming natural. I thought I was becoming the machine I built. But tonight I saw a boy. A scared, stupid, crying boy. And I couldn't do it. Maybe there's still something human left in me, after all. Harold Beckman returned to Nebraska in November 1945. He was decorated. The Silver Star. The Bronze Star with cluster. A Purple Heart for a wound he never talked about. The Distinguished Service Cross, which General Eisenhower personally pinned to his chest. But when he got off the bus in Hartwell, still population 347, still mostly corn, he wasn't thinking about medals. He was thinking about his father. Raymond Sr. was waiting at the bus stop. Older now, grayer. The farm had nearly broken him while Harold was gone. Father and son stood there for a long moment. Neither spoke. Then Raymond did something he hadn't done since Harold was 6 years old. He hugged him. "You're home, boy. You're finally home." Harold moved back to the farm, started working the land again, tried to pretend the war had never happened. But some things couldn't be forgotten. The nightmares came every night. German faces, the sound of his weapon, the smell of blood and cordite. Sometimes Harold would wake up screaming. Sometimes he'd wake up and not know where he was. And then there was the matter of Prototype 38. Harold had brought it back with him. Couldn't leave it behind. This thing he'd built from nothing. This weapon that had saved his life and ended so many others. It sat in his closet. He looked at it sometimes, never touched it, until one day in 1947, when Harold did something unexpected. He took Prototype 38 apart, completely disassembled it, laid out every piece on his workbench, and then he started building something else. Not a weapon, a tractor engine, using the same principles, the same precision, the same understanding of how machines work, but for a different purpose. The tractor spring that had been the heart of his killing machine, he put it in an irrigation pump. It ran for 30 years. Harold Beckman never became famous. Not really. The war produced too many heroes, too many stories. By the 1950s, most people had forgotten about the skinny farm boy with a homemade Tommy gun. But the men who served with him never forgot. Every year, until the last one died in 2019, the surviving members of Harold's platoon would gather somewhere. Sometimes Nebraska, sometimes other places. They'd drink. They'd tell stories. They'd remember. And they'd always talk about Harold. "Pipes saved my life 3 times. 3 different times. You know, he built that thing from tractor parts." Tractor parts. I laughed at him. We all laughed at him. Stupidest thing I ever did. Harold got married in 1951. A woman named Clara from a town about 50 miles away. They had 3 children, built a life. He never told Clara the full story. Never told his kids about the 127 confirmed kills or the 45 seconds that made him a legend. He was just Dad, a farmer, a quiet man who was really good at fixing machines. But he did one thing that ensured his story wouldn't be forgotten. In 1975, Harold donated his complete journals, the Nebraska prototypes, the military modifications, the war entries to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. He attached a note. "I was just a kid who wanted to understand how things worked. The war gave me a chance to prove that understanding matters." I hope these pages show young people that you don't have to be strong or brave or special to make a difference. You just have to be willing to learn, to fail, and to try again. Harold R. Beckman, Nebraska. So what's the takeaway here? What's the lesson? I could tell you it's about perseverance. 37 failed prototypes before success. 5 years of work before vindication. I could tell you it's about innovation. A farm boy with no formal training is building something that professionals couldn't imagine. I could tell you it's about courage. One man against impossible odds. But honestly, I think the lesson is simpler than that. The lesson is that the people who mock you don't know what you're capable of. And sometimes, neither do you. Harold Beckman didn't know he was going to kill 21 Germans in 45 seconds. He didn't know he was going to become a legend. He didn't even know his weapon would actually work in combat. He just knew he wanted to understand, wanted to build, wanted to prove that this thing he'd been obsessed with for years wasn't stupid after all. The mockery he faced was real, painful, relentless, but it didn't stop him. He kept building, kept learning, kept pushing forward. And when his moment came, when everything he'd built and learned and suffered through was finally put to the test, he was ready. That's the lesson. Be ready. Do the work. Ignore the laughter. Because one day, the world will give you 45 seconds to prove everyone wrong. And you better not waste them. Harold Raymond Beckman died on October 12, 1997. He was 72 years old, surrounded by his family. On the farm where he was born, the tractor spring that started everything was still running irrigation pumps in the lower field. At his funeral, they played taps. Someone from the local VFW gave a speech about his service. Nobody mentioned the 21 Germans or the 45 seconds. But his grandson, a kid named Eric who was 12 at the time, knew the stories. Had heard them from the old men who visited sometimes. Had read some of the journals. And as they lowered the casket into the ground, Eric made a decision. He was going to be an engineer. I was going to learn to build things. He was going to understand machines the way his grandfather had. Eric Beckman is now 40 years old. He worked for SpaceX, helps design the engines that are taking humanity to Mars. The lesson didn't die with Harold. It got passed down, transformed, applied to new challenges. That's how legacies work. That's how change happens. One person figures something out, passes it on, and the world shifts just a little bit.